Now that we've chosen a text and we have had a tour of the text, of its different elements, the first session or first lesson in actually studying the text, I have two goals. Goal number one is the participants should develop a clear, not overly complicated, but fairly detailed timeline, roadmap of where this text and where they themselves fall in history and the relationship between us. And I'll explain that momentarily. And the second goal is that they should develop an approach to the text that I will describe as reverential, awe or reverence for the text. Because the rabbis tell us that someone who studies Torah with a perspective of awe or reverence, they will retain their Torah. And someone who doesn't, they will lose it. And I've always used this approach, and it's always been successful. How do I give them this timeline roadmap of history? So first of all, the very first session, I warned them this is going to be longer than our ordinary session. If we ordinarily study for an hour, might be up to 2 hours, at least an hour and a half. If normally we study for half an hour, this first session is going to be an hour because it takes more time. And I ask them to draw it themselves. I'll use a whiteboard. I'll ask them to create their own map in this way. And the map starts probably at Abraham. It could start as anywhere in the text. The truth is, it could start as early as Adam and Eve, 5,700 years ago. But it has key points in the history, and then where each of the texts that we call Torah falls in that history. So we have where the Chumash is with Moses, and then we have where the start of the prophets, Joshua and the prophets, and where those are written, all the way to the end of the Tanakh, and then the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then the Midrashim, and then the commentators, and then the Shulchan Aruch, and by the way, this applies to, it doesn't matter what their background is, because this is the history of every Jew. And then I put in there the 19th century, I throw in development of Reform Judaism, and then the 20th century and 21st century, and say, and here we are. You can see the sweeping. I'm not teaching these things. I'm just giving them a sense of the basic history. This is so basic to many of us who are teachers, but the participants in our classes don't have this. And this gives them, I think, the correct historical perspective of, okay, so here I have this book in front of me. This is how this relates to me, at least historically, in a simple way. And have them write it out in some kind of notebook that they're asked to use, and that will guide them. I can refer back to that again and again and again in the future. And in conjunction with this, I use the Torah tree handout, which is on the website, which you can download, which shows the ideological relationship between these texts. So those two together, those two charts, they have now their own historical timeline, and they have their own this Torah tree. That's something we can refer to again and again as we go through the actual Chumash itself. I'd like to point out the following mnemonic, by the way, which has been very useful for me, which is the number 400. Now, the number 400 isn't precise at all. It's accurate enough that we can use it to teach history. And we start with 1700 BCE, which is a year in the life of Abraham Avinu, and then add 400 years, and you get to 1300, and that's Moses. And then you take another 400 years, and you get to 900, and that's roughly King Solomon and building the first temple. First temple, of course, stands for about 400 years. Again, I'm rounding off, just trying to help remember. Now, there was a 70-year break between temples, but the second temple also stood for 400 years. And then my years get off a little bit, so I asked them to remember the number 70 CE for the destruction of the second temple. Another 400 years after that, we have the finishing of the Babylonian Talmud. Another 400 years after that, you have the last of the Midrashim. Another 400 years after that, around 1300, you have Maimonides. Another 400 years after that, I'm wiggling a little bit here, but you have the Shulchan Aruch. Another 400 years after that, you have today. And these are just ballpark dates to give them a sense of, help them remember. I tell them next time you're in a cocktail party and someone asks you about Jewish history, just remember 400 years, and that'll help you, answer questions about your own Jewish history. Now, how to give them a sense of reverence or awe? Well, the best way I found to do this is to tell a story that is based on something to do with the Torah. A story, a true story. I have my own true story. You come up with your own true story. Maybe it's a legendary story from one of the you know figures of the past, like the Baal Shem Tov, or another legendary leader, but a story that shows how precious this text is. And perhaps I'll give over the story. I don't want to tell my story because it's very, very personal. But if you'd like to hear my story, so send me an email. I'll tell you the story I tell, and maybe that will help you. You can use my story perhaps, or maybe that'll help you think about your own story to tell.